Thanks so much for joining us. We've got a great discussion lined up for you today. On the event, you'll hear from experts at Illumio and discover how you can better secure your company's data. My name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'll be serving as the moderator. Before I introduce you to our speakers, first off, I want you to know that we want this event to be educational. We encourage your questions on this topic. This is a hot topic. So many companies out there are struggling to implement a higher level of security and protect themselves from data exfiltration and ransomware and malicious attacks. So if you have a question around this topic of zero trust, use the questions panel there to ask your question, and we'll be doing a dedicated Q&A session with our expert presenters. We also have a number of handouts available for download there in your audience console in the Handouts tab. I encourage you to check those out and download those. And then finally, at the end of the webinar, we'll announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card. If you're watching this on demand, of course, the drawing has already occurred. The price, terms, and conditions can be found there in the Handouts tab. In addition to that, we have our Best Question prize, where you have the chance to win a $50 Amazon gift card for asking the best question on the event today. Prize winners will be selected and contacted after the event via email, and you must still, of course, meet the Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions. And with that, I'm excited now to introduce you to our three expert presenters. Welcome, Nathaniel Iverson, Chief Evangelist; Trevor Deering, Technical Director for Europe, Middle East, and Africa; and Raghu Nandakumara, Field CTO for EMEA and APAC. Thank you so much for being on the event. I'll first hand it off to you, Trevor. Take it away.
So thanks, Dave. My name is Trevor Deering, and I'm the Technical Director for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and I will be asking the questions. So first, let me introduce my two guests. So the first person is Raghu Nandakumara. He's one of our field CTOs who joined us after working for many years for one of the world's largest banks. He's based in London and spends a lot of time with customers in Europe and the Asia Pacific region. He has a great ability to take complex ideas and explain them in a simple way. In fact, he claims he's able to explain the laws of cricket and the offside rule in soccer, but that may actually be a step too far. My second guest is Nathaniel Iverson. He was one of our first Illumineers and is our Chief Evangelist. He's based in California and he's worked for a number of startups over the years. As you can tell from his location, he is part engineer, part troubadour. And if we're very lucky, he may actually answer some of the questions in song, but we shall wait and see. Because of the large number of virtual events we've run, I've gathered some questions from audiences across the globe, which I'm going to put to my guests. If you want to add to this list, then please submit using the Q&A pane, and I'll throw them in as we go along, or else I'll add them at the end. So let's get started. And the first one is a question for Nathaniel. And it's basically, there's been so much discussion on zero trust, but one thing that puzzles me is that before we had zero trust, we identified the bad guys and tried to stop them. But now that we have zero trust, we identify the good guys and allow them to do things. So why is this better?
Well, it usually just turns out to be simpler. I mean, in your simple analogy of just, the good guys and the bad guys, we generally know the people that work for our organization, the contractors, et cetera, that are attached to the organization, much more than we know the other 9 billion people that are scattered across the surface of the planet. And the same principle actually holds true for the machines that are inside of our data centers. It turns out that we can have a decent idea about them, and ultimately, most of them behave in very self-similar and very predictable ways. And so if we are able to isolate individual applications or exercise control at a granular level, well, then it just cuts out a lot of potential unwanted traffic. It could well house malicious intent.
But surely it must be easier just to block stuff?
Well, perhaps at a high level. I mean, if you know exactly what you want to block, then sure. But then you have to know exactly all the things that you want to block, not some of the things, every single one. And that turns out to be very hard. For most applications, it's a far smaller list of things that the application legitimately does. So it's actually less work to go ahead and specify the things that you don't want. In practice, I think many organizations have some mix of deny statements. You may say something simple like dev can't talk to prod, but then you have all the interesting ways, of course, in which dev needs to talk to prod for core services and other things like that.
So, I mean, Raghu, you've obviously, I mean, you come from the other side. You've sort of lived this and gone through some of this journey as a customer. So, is it an easy transition to go from that sort of world of stop to world of go?
So I think easy may not be the right word for it, but it's not difficult, and it's not difficult as long as you don't try and do everything overnight, right? It's that whole thing of not trying to boil the ocean, and just starting very small and very targeted. Really saying, okay, here is where I think I'm going to get most value from this, or here is where I can safely start and work with establishing an allow list model, or establishing only what I want to permit and denying everything else, whichever way you want to, whatever model you want to call this. That's a very easily digestible approach to take to adopting this, in inverted commas, new approach to security, right? That's doable for sure.
And is it something that other people within the organization, I guess, who are not traditionally security focused, do they sort of understand that concept or that difference, or is it just a bit too subtle?
So I think there's many ways to frame it, right? And often it's just simply saying you're going to get better security, right, is a wonderful kind of aim to have, but it's often not enough to convince application owners, businesses, etc., to adopt it. So it needs to be framed in a way that is, how is it a benefit to that particular business? How is it a benefit to that particular application? How is it going to enable them to go faster? If you can frame it as a security practitioner, if you can frame it in that way, you can actually go and get buy-in, and they start to like it, because it does enable them to go and do the development they want to do in a secure manner.
Okay, so I mean, obviously, one of the reasons that we're here is to talk about segmentation, and we talk about the concept of zero trust segmentation. So Nathaniel, why is that sort of different? How does segmentation fit into the zero trust model?
Well, it's fairly foundational to the whole model. If you were to take out the word zero trust and use the word that used to be used called least privilege, that actually goes back to the 60s from a computer science perspective, you would end up at the exact same place. That is, it's simply just the idea that things should only have the permissions that they absolutely need. And typically that gets expressed across the idea of network connectivity, which is segmentation. It gets expressed across identity and access management in terms of user permissions and data storage, and on and on and on. If you follow Forrester or any of the other leading zero trust frameworks, they take that simple idea of least privilege and extend it across all of these different things. And of course, from the perspective of segmentation, the main thing is, obviously, if you can't get to something, the you being a piece of malware, being a person with ill intent, if you're not able to get somewhere, it is then impossible to hack it, to take advantage of it, to compromise it. And so the idea of zero trust is just a practical application of the principle of least privilege to things like networks.
So why not just use existing firewalls, for instance, to do it?
Well, I think there's a couple of problems. The first is that they're not really in the right place. If you think about most data centers, where's the firewall? Well, it's all the way up at the very top of the environment somewhere. It's up there, separating dev and prod or doing something like that. What if I want to put the ring or the fence around a single application, or just one of the components of the application? That firewall is just not in the right place to affect the necessary change. The second reason, and perhaps more importantly, is an operational one. It turns out that writing firewall rules is fairly slow. And after all, it kind of has to be. the reality is that when people write a firewall rule, they have to say things like 192, 168, 1743, space 1927, 1314, space 3306 permit. And while that may make perfect sense to a firewall, it doesn't make a shred of sense to people. And the trouble is that organizations then have to translate constantly between that language of the machines, the IP addresses, and the words that we use, which is to say, this application has a web server, an application server, and a database server, and we want them to talk in some way. And so between the problem of the firewalls being in the wrong place and then kind of being set up with the wrong operational motion, it turns out that it's just fairly cumbersome to try to affect meaningful separation using hardware firewalls.
So Raghu, you talk to loads of people around the world, and they must be trying lots of different ways to solve this problem with firewalls and big data systems and a whole host of things. There must be a point in the conversation or during that time when they realize that firewalls or that type of technology just isn't going to work. I mean, how does that conversation actually go?
Yeah, sure. So Nathaniel spoke about the fact that firewall rules in essence lack context. So I'm going to come back onto that particular point in a second. In order to do microsegmentation effectively, you need really three things. You need context. So you need to be able to understand at a level above IP addresses and ports and protocols what the actual workloads you're talking about, what are they, right? What is the context around them? What purpose do they serve in the relation to an application in your organization? So that's context. The second thing is you need visibility. You need the ability to understand the relationship between different systems based on their context to allow you to make decisions as to whether something is required or something is not required. And finally, you need the ability to go and enforce that control at the granularity you wish to. Now, if we think about this in the context of traditional firewalls, firstly, the rules, the representation of the policy within those firewalls lacks the context. Secondly, while they can provide you with visibility through flow data, they're unable to provide the relationship between connections, which means that you often require the use of some form of third-party system to help build that relationship. And finally, network-based controls are always at the mercy of the network architecture to allow them to establish the granularity of that control. So even if you've chopped up your network into very, very small, tiny chunks, which if you ask any network engineer, they will absolutely say that that's the exact opposite of what they wish to do. Still, it's the case that if you've got two workloads on a network and you want to segment between those two, you want to establish some control between those two, you cannot do that with a network-based approach, so with a traditional firewall. So for these reasons, leveraging traditional firewalls to go and solve the problem of microsegmentation at any reasonable scale is just impractical. And we find this time and again with prospects and customers.
So I've got some follow-up to firewalls. I'll come back to that a bit later. But what I wanted to sort of ask Nathaniel, and we've seen this I've heard this quite a few times at various things, is that if I'm starting my journey on zero trust, so I imagine here I'm off on my journey, and I'm going to do two projects to start with, and one is identity and access management, and the second is segmentation. So what are the things that I should start segmenting? Where do I start on that journey?
Well, I think if you're starting segmentation, you're going to want to go for the places you can get an immediate benefit. The simple example is often your core and management services. If you think about a lot of the things that have made the news in the last couple of news cycles, what is it? It's ransomware. It's a kind of malware that comes in and encrypts things, jumps from server to server. And that raises the question, how does it jump? Almost exclusively, it passes on common ports like RDP and SMB, the kind of enterprise protocols that are on by default, that probably aren't used universally, but they're there, they're on, and they're available. And for many organizations, it's relatively easy to close off those ports and get an immediate benefit from the core services and the management services, that immediate kind of low-hanging fruit. One of the most common things that we've seen people have as a policy desire is the idea of application ring fencing. That is, to put a ring or a fence around the applications that are in the data center. And it turns out that if you do that, you'll get about a 90% reduction in the ability for things to move east-west laterally across the data center. So that's a very simple policy that gives you just a massive bang for the buck. And so many organizations will start with their core services, move on to application ring fencing, and then certainly for crown jewels, things that are super important to the business, they'll obviously address those as well. But those would be three simple answers for you.
Yeah, so Raghu, I mean, on the finance side, how do things like PCI and Swift and all of that fit into that sort of discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's really interesting, because while as security practitioners, we've kind of done the dance around microsegmentation for a number of years, right? So this has been something that we've all wished we'd had, and we've talked about it numerous times, but it's always felt that it was, let's say, too complex to achieve. Now, what we have seen with regulations, we talk about financial services, so Swift and PCI DSS for the payments industry. These are starting to actually mandate the use of segmentation to protect their specific assets. So Swift, in the case of Swift, it's about segregating off, segmenting off Swift infrastructure within a financial services organization from the rest of the estate to protect Swift on the back of the well-publicized breach a few years ago that leveraged Swift to main the Swift infrastructure to mount sort of a huge sort of financial fraud. PCI is slightly different. With PCI, we're leveraging microsegmentation to solve a scoping problem. Anyone who is attempted to achieve PCI compliance knows that they fall at two extremes. They either underscope the problem and leave themselves at the risk of not being fully compliant, or they overscope it and they have a huge expensive exercise to undertake. So these regulations are starting to really mandate the use of segmentation, but often the problems they're trying to solve are different from one to the other. So it's important to understand the specific problem and then leverage microsegmentation properly to solve that problem.
So when we're trying to solve this problem, and people have been trying to solve this problem for a while, and I'm going to come back to something you were talking about a while ago, Nathaniel, when you spoke about the fact that trying to do this with traditional firewalls is quite a difficult thing, because you've got all the established processes, you have the department of segmentation effectively, and rule writing, and everything goes through that group. And if we're trying to do that on this scale, it gets really difficult. So how can you automate that process? And a lot of the things you spoke about, like ring fencing and stuff like that, again, it sounds like deny rules. So how do we automate that process and make it all work and all fly smoothly?
Well, I think the key to any automation is abstraction. In other words, you will never automate faster than your ability to abstract from the infrastructure, just as a general principle. And that's true if you're in Amazon doing application things. It's true if you're in the data center doing segmentation. And so when an organization begins to abstract from the network, they're going to use names. They're going to use things like labels in order to describe their systems. And so the first thing that you do is you break the dependence on IP addresses. Just like your server administrators in Amazon cannot use the IP addresses as the source for their automation, you can't with your segmentation either. And it turns out that for most organizations, this is not hard. It's actually very easy, because we've been calling servers names for years. They're loaded up in the CMDB. They're in the host naming convention. They may be in DNS naming conventions. They may be in IP address management systems, but there's names all across the organization. And what happens is when you start to describe your policy in terms of those names, it gets easy to say what you want, because they're the names that are already in use. They're the ones that people use to describe the stuff that's running around in the data center. And so when you can do that, it does become possible to greatly simplify things if you've got them organized by things like the name of the application. Is it in the dev or the prod environment? Which data center location is it in? When the metadata, or the labels, if you will, contain that information, all of a sudden writing policy becomes a simple affair.
So, I mean, Raghu, this, I think that's great. You got the names, and I remember when servers were all named after characters from Lords of the Rings and things like that. So that would have got a bit tricky to do it in that stage. But you've got, I mean, the real world, you've got external services, you've got things you can't control, you've got OT devices, you've got external web domains now, you've got. If you're automating this and using labels and to do this, and you may have some really smart sort of AI based system, how does that all fit in? Because the world isn't just servers with really nice structured names.
Yeah, so absolutely right. And servers, so if they have nice structured names, that really aids your automation significantly, because you could just extract that information from those structured names. However, ultimately, you do, and Nathaniel referred to this, right? You have some source of truth that provides you with the context around all of these things that you want to represent, whether it's IT, OT, internet domains, etc. And it's just understanding or identifying what the source of truth is and having those feed into your policy engine, such that you can leverage this common language to go and build your microsegmentation policies, right? So we're not dependent on one single source of truth. We're dependent on the right source of truth for the particular set of assets that you're looking to protect.
I think the other thing that happens is that in the great wide world, there are different kinds of objects or things that you would need to abstract. In some cases, to your point, Trevor, you are abstracting a single system, and so its name is the obvious thing. But what if you have a subnet that has nothing in it but IP cameras? Well, all of a sudden, do you need a name for that, or is just the IP range itself a sufficient abstraction for that whole group of IP cameras? And so sometimes just a range is acceptable. In other cases, you might be dealing with a SaaS service in the cloud. And what do you get there? Well, you get a name, but it's a host name. It's not an IP address. In fact, you never get an IP address. And so you need to be able to deal with your policy just on the basis of that abstraction into a host name. And so I think you're right that as you think about different places, I mean, yes, there's names for servers, but there's also IP ranges. There's things that you might use host names for, and yet other things as well.
Good. Before we move on to the next subject, so I've actually got a question come in. This is from someone in Paris. So, and I imagine working for a bank. So they're basically saying if they install Illumio, does that make them PCI compliant?
So, right. So just by installing Illumio, absolutely not. It's like saying just by installing a firewall is my perimeter suddenly secure. No. As I said, going back to kind of the previous question that we had around compliance, it's understanding what is the requirement from PCI, right? How do I have a microsegmentation tool set that provides me context, visibility, enforcement. What is the specific set of requirements that PCI lays out? And then how can I leverage this set of controls, this set of tools to help me fulfill those requirements? And I know that we have that for Illumio. We've got that productivity report that maps the Illumio capability set against the specific items within the PCI standards document. So you can leverage that to help you build the PCI controls and leverage Illumio to help achieve PCI compliance.
Okay, thank you. So moving on. So, I get how this all works in the data center, but obviously everyone's talking about digital transformation and clouds and multi-clouds and fog and edge computing and all sorts of weird stuff. So how do you take this model of segmentation into the cloud to give you that sort of consistency? So Nathaniel, I'll throw that one to you.
Well, I think you take it there very easily. The reality is that the cloud is already a place that's fully abstracted. And the beautiful thing is that when you have the security down at the level of individual instances, it becomes very easy to just ignore location completely. And honestly, in a multi-cloud environment, that is the best approach. Like, the location does not matter. In fact, you may not even control it to any large extent, depending on how you've set up your different zones. I think one of the biggest problems people face in those kind of very hybrid, multi-whatever environments is simply that if you start multiplying the native controls, it can get out of hand very quickly, since many of them are not particularly scalable if you're a large enterprise. And so it becomes relatively important to just extend the controls you've had in the data center. If you've got a good microsegmentation deployment there, you just simply want to extend that across all of your various cloud, fog, whatever locations, because then you have just a whole single pane that you can deal with the whole thing from.
So I get that sort of thing, but I get, Raghu, is this tied to specific cloud platforms? Because there's obviously, if you think about the shared responsibility model between the cloud consumer and the cloud provider, does this sort of concept of segmentation, is that dependent on what cloud platform you're actually using?
No, not at all, right? Microsegmentation, ultimately, you could leverage that in any of the cloud service providers that exist, like all the, particularly, definitely, kind of all the big ones. And in fact, if you just look at how the services provided by those service providers are kind of laid out, they actually encourage the use of zero trust security principles. They encourage the use of microsegmentation as part of their best practice. So by adopting microsegmentation in cloud, you're actually doing what the cloud service providers are encouraging you to do, to ensure that you're getting the best value out of the security capability set and ensuring that your workloads are properly protected in the cloud. And this applies to both sort of traditional infrastructure as a service compute, virtual compute, but also to the sort of the other services available, whether it's serverless, platform as a service, etc. So it is absolutely something that is, I would say, in many ways, is tailor-made for the way sort of cloud adoption best practices should be followed.
And obviously in the United States, the adoption of cloud is somewhat ahead of where it is in the rest of the world. And we saw some recent statements or orders coming from the president on some of these things that are now not just for government agencies, but seem to be for everything else. So is that, that sort of the things that came out in that executive order, how do they, are they applicable for the cloud, and how does segmentation fit into that? I mean, I'm going to obviously ask Nathaniel because he's there about this one. So what are you seeing with the relationship between these executive orders and the way that people are adopting things like zero trust?
Well, for organizations that are attached to the US government, that order is mandatory, and it encompasses everything from cloud to data center to the laptops that people may be working on. It's very comprehensive, and it's something that they have to have architectures ready by a certain date and implementations ready by yet other dates. And so for them, it's a mandate. I think what is interesting is that there are very many commercial organizations that follow the NIST directives. That order specifically called out some of the NIST standards for segmentation and said, you have to do these particular things. And there are many watchers of what the Department of Defense does, many watchers of what the US government specifies, or NSA. And so when the president of the United States takes the trouble to say, this is what you need to do, a lot of people are paying attention to that. When that was followed up just 2 weeks later by the president basically saying to all commercial businesses, hey, look, I can't make you do this, but you really, really need to adopt zero trust and better segmentation. That's an incredibly powerful statement. I don't know that in my life I've heard a president of the United States talking about security. And so I think that's more a statement of what is the case in the world today. This is something that people need to pay attention to. It's something that has to do with the health and the security of the whole global economy. And so I think it's just underlining the seriousness of what's at stake.
So one of the reasons I asked that question is that we've had a question come in, and we may not know the answer to this, but I'll ask anyway, which is for US, companies that are based in Europe or Asia Pacific, South America, anywhere that are dealing with US government agencies, do you think that's something that's going to roll into that sort of space as well?
Well, I think it's hard to say at this point. I mean, there won't be a mandate, immediately that they have to, but I think that's very natural. We've certainly seen things like that in the financial services industry, where first the financial services microsegmented, and then they told their law firms that they needed to microsegment. And so I think it's the kind of thing that often is progressive. One organization does it, and then their suppliers are asked or forced to comply to retain their contracts.
I mean, it was interesting to sort of see that, especially France was actually highlighted as a place where a lot of this is already actually happening through things like LPM. So Raghu, when you're sort of talking with, and I know it's actually wider than just France, but it's specifically around some of those areas, do you get into conversations about some of the I guess the legal implications in countries with the rush of regulations that are coming out around privacy, around critical infrastructure? Are you getting into a lot of conversations about that sort of thing?
Yeah, because I think a lot of the time the drivers in security investments come from the fact that organizations need to now comply with some new regulations, some new industry standards. So absolutely, with a number of prospects globally across a number of different verticals, they all are, or the majority of them, are doing microsegmentation because they need to comply with some specific requirement. So we have a lot of conversations around that, because as a vendor, it's important for us to understand what specific requirements are and the nuances around which around which microsegmentation could be a possible solution to help meet a part of that, so that we can properly communicate the value of our capability set in the context of that particular requirement. So yes, this is something that we run into every day.
So does microsegmentation address some of these new things like the NIST directive in Europe, for instance?
It's without getting into specifics, it's a key part. I think if we look at these directives, they emphasize the terminology about least privilege or zero trust, right? And going back to the top of our conversation, microsegmentation is a key foundation of a zero trust approach to security. So yes, microsegmentation does address at least some part of these directives.
Okay. So, conscious that we are keeping an eye on the time, I've got a number of questions that have come in, and I'll sort of dish these out as required. So, and I guess this is a Nathaniel. So this is everyone's talking about SecOps, DevSecOps, DevOps. Make your own names up after that. So how can you quickly deploy applications that are already protected in those environments?
Well, we've got quite a bit of experience with this, and I think that really there's kind of two options. The one is that you kind of bake it into some kind of golden image so that the security follows the golden image around. And the second way, of course, is that you blow it in with personality as the automation stack is turning it into a database or a web server or whatever it is. And behind that, I think that you need to have some policy automation. You need to have an API-driven policy engine that allows you to treat segmentation as a service. In other words, you should be able to call for segmentation using an API, the exact same way that you'd call for some kind of cloud service or directory or protocol or database service. You should be able to call your segmentation in the same way. And so if you have your enforcing technology able to be blown on flexibly by the automation, and then it can basically call for segmentation as a service, all of a sudden your segmentation can absolutely move just as fast as your whole automation motion itself.
Yeah, I think that's probably very important for those organizations moving to the cloud, especially in those where they want to roll that sort of stuff up. So I got this one's probably a bit more ragu shaped, and it comes back to sort of zero trust is about having 100% full allow list. That needs to be correct. I mean that's really difficult. So that someone's asked a question of basically, is it practical to try and aim for this complete 100% correct allow list to get to zero trust segmentation?
So it would seem kind of overbearing and impractical to achieve, but it's really about kind of breaking that down into much smaller chunks, right? So we talked a lot of the questions, Trevor, you've asked me about are about compliance, right? So as organizations want to adopt zero trust, and they need some kind of lever that they can pull on to help them get on the way to that journey, right? So what do? They look around and say, okay, right, what part of my estate is critical, probably has some external compliance requirements around it that I can use as a starting point, right? Once you break it down into that, then in order to make progress towards this allow list-based approach, you only need perfect information or semi-perfect information for that very small part of your estate, right? So you've reduced the scope of the problem significantly. You can focus on that, improve the security posture of that. Because it's probably a critical part of your infrastructure, your overall risk has now reduced. And then you can continue to do this and iterate through. So over time, rather than going from 0 to 100 in one step, but that step may be very, very far down in your timeline, instead what you're doing is that you're progressively taking small steps, but at every stage you're improving your security posture. So can you get to a full allow list model? Yes, you can, but the practical way to do that is to start small and continuously improve.
Okay, I'm going to come to Nathaniel for some input on that, but I've got another supplementary question for that as well. The questions are rolling in at the moment. So does an organization need to be in full enforcement to be fully compliant?
That's a great question, right? And it really depends on what they mean by what is their definition of compliance, right? So from one organization to the next, the security standards that they have, what they measure compliance against will be different, right? And some of them may be, we've talked about, let's say, production and non-production segmentation, right? That may be the requirement to achieve compliance, and further ring fencing itself may not necessarily be required, whereas other organizations need full ring fencing around each of their applications to be compliant. So microsegmentation, having the right tool set, allows you to solve both of these problems and any other problems in between, right? So it's really about adapting the control to what your requirements are, rather than essentially starting with that control and saying, this is the only set of things I can do.
Okay. And Nathaniel, I know you have a view on this as well, but quickly.
Well, I think that when you're going out to write yourself a zero trust policy for the first time, you're going to want to do it in the most efficient way possible. And there's going to be things that you definitely don't want, and there's going to be things that you definitely need. And if you have the right policy model, it's possible to express both of those things. And this is the fast way to get there, as Raghu mentioned. You don't have to be right about everything. You can be right about the things that you're confident about. And I think that's what I find, is that these zero trust deployments move at the rate of confidence. And so if you're starting with a couple things you don't know and a couple things that you do know, it's enough for you to get started on zero trust and make a difference right away.
Good, thank you. And while I've got you, there's another question, and this is one that I've heard several times, but it's been asked again. The difference between using stateful and stateless firewalls in the zero trust environment.
Wow, I guess that one's down in the technical weeds. I mean, but generally, I think the whole idea of stateful versus stateless was kind of solved, or at least decided many, many years ago, when the industry decided that, yes, it was indeed a good idea for firewalls to be able to chase the high order ports that get negotiated by server connections. So I think, broadly speaking, everybody is interested in stateful firewalls. The day for plain packet filters, I think, is long past.
Good, thank you. I really just a couple more, and these are actually a bit producty, so we have to give. Obviously we get asked all sorts of questions. So this one here, is your solution just SaaS? Raghu.
We can, if you want to consume it as SaaS, we can deliver it as SaaS. And we have a number of customers of various sizes that do consume our SaaS solution. Equally, if you want to deploy on-prem for a whole host of reasons, we deliver it as software that you can install on any commodity server, and you can run our infrastructure entirely in your own data center. So we do both, whichever you prefer.
Thank you. And the final one, really, and again, I think this is a Nathaniel one, and this is all about how long it takes to actually get to some form of security. So if you went into an organization, you started from scratch, how long does it take to get there? I mean, someone said that on our website, we're claiming that we can segment in minutes. How true is that?
Well, it's actually very true. I'll give you a super simple example. Let's say something that there's a core service that you have. Something, maybe it's LDAP, maybe it's part of an Active Directory protocol. It could be, something for Splunk or Nagios. You know exactly how that service works. It comes from 1 or 5 or 6 or 8 servers in the data center. It doesn't come from 100. It comes from a very defined set of locations. And where does it go? It goes to all the servers in the data center. It's a core service. So how easy is it to specify what you want to have happen? You want that core service to be available to all the servers in the data center. It doesn't take long to specify that. And if you can move that immediately into enforcement, you can literally have your segmentation in minutes, and get that going. It's something that is real to get done quickly.
But I suspect it's not that easy with a firewall.
It is not. You are correct. Just the translation to and from the IP addresses would take some time, as we've discussed.
Yeah. Okay. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time, and obviously, thank you for your great answers and your input on this. And so we do have there are some more questions coming in, and what we'll do is we'll collect those up, and we'll send those out and answer them directly via email or communication. So thank you, and I'd like to just hand back to Dave.
All right. Thank you so much, Trevor, Nathaniel, and Raghu. Really excellent discussion and presentation there. I learned a lot. I know that the audience did as well. I want to call everyone's attention to the poll question that I've just brought up there on the screen for you. The question is, what additional information would you like about the Illumio solution? And this is a multi-select question, so feel free to select more than one option on the screen there. And I'll leave that up for a few moments here, allow everyone to respond. I also want to remind you about the handouts tab. It's there that you can download 4 different resources about the zero trust and segmentation topic. So make sure that you download those resources now. They won't be as readily available after the event. And I'll just leave up the poll for you to respond to while I announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card. This gift card is going out to Kaylin Canode from Texas. Congratulations, Kaylin Canode from Texas. We'll reach out to you to deliver that prize. Also, we'll reach out to our best question prize winner as well. Thank you for all the excellent questions. The experts from Illumio are responding as quickly as they can, and we do appreciate your questions. I'll leave the poll question up for one more moment here and let everyone respond, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you for your participation on the webinar today, how to get the fast track to Zero Trust Segmentation in partnership with Illumio. I hope you learned a lot, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.